Well, hey friends, welcome to Cinematic Scripture, where I help Christians watch attentively, reflect spiritually, and lead from story. Every great story has a moment of response, a shift from the ache to action, from disruption to direction. And today's episode is about this sacred step, where clarity begins and calling takes form. For me, it was a step of faith when I stepped off the machine and into what God was leading me towards. I'm Kyle, and this is Cinematic Scripture, where faith and film get a seat at the same table. Let's roll film. All right, so disruption didn't just crack the surface, it shattered the glass ceiling. But as I sat there among the pieces, formation began to take root. Stories stopped being entertainment, and they became sacred ground. I didn't need more answers. I needed language. And it was film school that gave me that language. I'd already been to Bible college. I'd walked through that. Now I'm in ministry. And I went to film school because I always wanted to be a writer, a script writer. And as I went to film school and it began to give me this language, not just for screenwriting techniques, but it also gave me a lens to see story as an opportunity for sacred conversation. To kind of recognize that discipleship isn't just teaching or programs, but it's it's embodied living. It's attention plus action. It's hearing and doing. It's walking out what you believe. And it was here at film school, as I'm studying this and I'm learning this and I'm seeing how stories work and script writing works, that I was finally given a language to answer the ache of every scene that moved me. What realm does this story live in? What does this story say is good or true or beautiful? And is this story telling the truth, or is it bending it? These questions weren't just film analysis. It was a way for spiritual formation to happen through cinematic encounters. I was able to move from just being entertained by movies to engaging them in conversation. It was like sitting down with a stranger and hearing their views of life and their story. And instead of being offended at what they're saying, their choice of language, maybe the way they're dressed or their views on life, whatever you want to use, I was able to see deeper, to listen more attentively, and to ask, where does this story live? To what realm? Are they trapped in darkness? Are they free in the kingdom? Or are they transitioning between the two? What are they saying is good, true, or beautiful? And is what they are saying true, or is it their version of truth, what they define as truth? See, with this framework in hand, I was finally in full conversation with films, as if they were people sitting there, sharing their stories. Everything shifted at that moment. I began to see grace in the character arcs of the films that I loved. Mercy in reversal, hope in quiet scenes that no sermon had ever named. And every frame, every scene began to have these echoes of the gospel, and I was finally able to name it. Even ones where God's name was never spoken, I could begin to see it. And then I found the Bible Project, guys. That's an awesome podcast, YouTube channel, by the way, the Bible Project. And scripture came alive. Because what I had learned in film school, the foreshadowing, the setups, the payoffs, the imagery, the arcs of narrative, I began to see in Genesis through Revelation. It was there in Genesis, it was there in Revelation, and it was when everything in between. Characters that were shaped by covenant, by conflict, by redemption. Themes that echoed across time. And the Bible, it was no longer a manual, right, for right living. It wasn't like, hey, here's this and this and this, and then debating about, well, what's Old Testament, what's New Testament, what do we follow, what do we not follow? It wasn't about this manual or this book of laws. It was a drama. It was the gospel. It was the good news that moved through texture and tension and imagery and people. And the Bible didn't just come alive in a new way through these revelations. My faith came alive too, because again, I finally had the language. I was taking the step. I had the language for my faith and for the stories I loved and for the ache that refused to stay quiet. And I realized that the disruption I had felt didn't drive me to bitterness or rebellion. It led me into attention, into engagement, and into listening beneath the surface. And what I saw in a scene, what began in a story, started shaping everything, because now I had clarity. Now it wasn't just theology, it was a calling. It was a calling to watch attentively, to reflect spiritually, and to lead from story. Everything had changed. The way I shared the gospel was beginning to change. The way I viewed scripture was changing, because now I had this living narrative before me across 66 books that was beautiful and dense and so rich in its tapestry of imagery and symbolism and foreshadowing and connecting and motifs. And I was just blown away. And as I'm walking through all this and learning how to engage it and learning how to deal with it, you got to keep in mind the machine is still turning. Like I'm still involved in church ministry. The machine of how it goes is still turning. And at the time, I didn't just want to step off, because I wasn't in this place that God was like, hey, you need to abandon all this or anything like that. It was just the way I had viewed things was beginning to shift. The narrative was coming alive. And I believed that God was calling me not to step off of the machine or to disengage in any certain way or anything like that, but to kind of go back to the story that began it, to make denominational doctrines second, to make arguments over Old Testament law and New Testament law. Like, I get there's a place for this stuff, but to simply go back to story, to not look at scripture looking to reinforce my opinion, to not read scripture to say, look, here's where I get my doctrine from and this is why, but to look and read scripture as a story, to be invited into the scenes. What is happening in Genesis 2 when God is creating the garden and he puts man and woman in it, and he gives them responsibility to flourish and multiply and oversee and govern with God in partnership. Like, it wasn't just like, oh yeah, here's where creation comes from, this is what I believe because the Bible. It was more of like a God inviting me to slow down and to engage the story of scripture, to go back to the story. Because again, I think I've shared it. If not, I'm going to share it a lot more. Like, scripture is a story. And when you read the New Testament, they shared the story. That's what they did. They shared the story of who God was. So I believe God was inviting me back to that story. Because if stories could hold what was sacred, if the story was what was important, the story of Jesus Christ, then because I was really starting to hold to that. Story was so vital. Then systems in our own churches that ignored story, they needed more than to be critiqued. It wasn't just enough to stand back and critique them. They needed to be reimagined. We needed to go back to the drawing board of, okay, if this is the story of Christ, of the church, then we need to rethink some things. And because story wasn't just about being entertained or a distraction, it was now about how we encounter and how we disciple through story. Jesus on the road to Emmaus, he meets the disciples and he tells them, starting with Moses and the prophets, the story of the Messiah. He shares the story. Stephen, standing before the Sanhedrin, he tells the story of Israel. Like Peter in Acts 2, he shares the story. This is what Christianity is sharing this story of Jesus Christ, this amazing story. And we had to have room for that. And it had to be vital. And it had to be part of, like, that's how we encounter and that's how we disciple, because that's what the early church did, reading it in scripture. And I was pulled into that the gospel, it was preached, but it wasn't just preached, it was revealed. And it could be revealed frame by frame and story by story. See, because when we pay attention to the story, we begin to see grace in action. We see mercy in the movement. And I do believe we see hope in places that no sermon dares to name. We see the longing of every human heart for justice. And we see the devastating results of being our own gods and defining our own truth. We see that in stories. This isn't about just film analysis and what's holy and what's secular and all that. There's conversation for that. That's not what this is. This is about formation taking shape. And for me, walking through this journey, I finally had a path that I could walk where my love for Jesus and my love for story were no longer competing, but they were walking side by side. They were informing each other. They were speaking into each other, because the very techniques of story that I was learning were the very techniques I found in Scripture. And then Scripture informed how I saw film. And it was just this unified walking together. And as the result, the story of Scripture was coming alive. And I wanted to share it more than I ever have in my entire life. I just wanted to share the story of how awesome God was about the world, the disruption, the action, the opposition, and the new world that is the story of the gospel. I wanted to share it with people. And friends, that's why I created Seeing Gospel and Story Challenge. It's a live 3-day experience where I help you reframe what you see, to interpret story with gospel clarity, and to engage culture with sacred presence. Because if you felt the same ache that I felt, if you've longed for deeper formation or a fresh lens for story and for Scripture, then this challenge is your next step. I want to help you move and learn and grow through the art of story, through the power of the gospel story. What took me 2 different degrees from 2 different schools and years to learn and years to navigate, I want to simplify that for you so you can be, your faith be brought alive through the power of the story of the gospel, and enable you to share that and to see gospel echoes in the stories around you. So man, if you felt that ache, if you long for deeper formation and a fresh lens for story and Scripture, then I check out the 3-day challenge, Seeing Gospel and Story Challenge. Spots are limited and the next one's coming up soon. So go to cinematicScripture.mykajabi.com/gospel in story to reserve your place. You're going to find the link in the description below. Because story doesn't just stir, it sends. And the challenge is your next step into sacred clarity. See, the disruption I faced, it spurred me to action. But like any story worth telling, once you take that step, once you take the action, friends, you are bound to face opposition. And for me, I had no idea what I was about to face. And honestly, if I would have known, I don't know if I would have stepped out into it, honestly. I didn't know what I was about to face. Hey, thanks for joining me for this. Until next time, I'm Kyle. This is Cinematic Scripture. Watch attentively, reflect spiritually, lead from story. And if you're ready to move from watching to engaging, step into the challenge. The link's in the description below, because discipleship lives in what we pay attention to, and it's in the stories we dare to enter. I'll see you next time.